that, I would like to introduce our moderator for the day, the great Peter Wilson from Australia, Wilson International Trading. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Randy, and welcome everybody from wherever you are around the world. I mean, I guess the great benefit of the web and our telecommunications systems today is that we can indeed communicate with people at all points of the globe, and information has never moved faster than it does today. And I guess we can get blow-by-blow descriptions of the pandemic and where it's active and where it's most active, and of course it has been quite the disorienting for many. And here in Australia we have lockdown, and they're saying a minimum for at least another 4 weeks. So we have kids home from school, and we have borders closed. And obviously in Australia we are an island nation, and yet for the first time in my memory, we've actually got police and transport officials closing the borders to everything other than road transport vehicles moving freight between our capital cities. So, we are not in unprecedented times, of course. Our forebears have seen much greater disruption, but certainly in living history, this is a major black swan event, and therefore I commend you to this webinar, and I also thank the GPC for their vision in making this sort of information available, particularly as it pertains to the pulse industry and the food industry and the logistics industry that supports them. Without any further ado, I will do a very quick intro to our panelists today, and I might just go to we'll just do the one by one. We'll do a very quick snapshot of each individual. We have Mahim Sharma from Glencore in India. We have Chris, the Nautical Director from Chris Oliver, Nautical Director for the International Chamber of Shipping. Stephen Paul, who I know well from my time in Canada, who's VP of Supply Chain at Ray-Mont Logistics, and Ritesh Ramakrishnan from Transworld Group. So we welcome those four, and I think just with an opening comment, we might start with Mahim. If you'd like to just do a very quick intro of yourself and indeed an opening statement as to how you're seeing it and how it's affecting you personally and the people around you.
Hello, everyone. Further to what Peter has already given an intro about, I head the shipping and logistics for Glencore Agriculture in India. The issue, of course, at hand has been quite serious in India because, as you might be aware, majority of the operations in India are still labor intensive. We have majority of the ports in India who have already declared a force majeure. Some of them who are still managing to operate are operating at very limited capacities. Because of this, of course, the supply chain of all agri-commodities as well as other essential and non-essential commodities has also been quite
Thanks, Mahim. If I could just ask Chris to say a few words on his behalf and his views of the world.
Hello, everybody. My name's Chris Oliver. I'm the Nautical Director at the International Chamber of Shipping, as Peter said. I'm an ex-ship's captain, not in the agriculture side of things, but with one of the American oil majors. I had 25 years in commercial operations with a Norwegian dry bulk company before coming to the Chamber in 2017. We, as ICS, represent somewhere in the region of 80% of world shipping. We are ship owner representatives, and I know you guys are generally the shippers, but I can give you a ship owner's perspective on the current situation with COVID and the problems that the shipping industry is encountering, and what actions both us generally as ICS and the shipping industry as a whole is taking with respect to that. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Chris and Stephen, all the way from the Great White North.
Good morning, or I guess good afternoon or good evening, depending on where everybody is. I am the VP of Supply Chain Logistics for Ray-Mont. We opened the freight forwarding division in 2009, and previous to that, I was a customer of Ray-Mont for 10 years prior to that, and that's where I've come across Peter over my history. In Canada, we've seen the impact of COVID-19 within the country itself is most non-essential businesses are at home. Us as an organization, our staff are all working remotely. We also operate transloading terminals as well. And those transloading terminals, as they are essential, are currently operating. It's been quite a challenge. With everything moving, we've actually seen an increase in demand for the movement of pulses. And with the increase in demand coupled with the logistical constraints that we'll get into as a group here today, those two combinations are particularly troublesome as we go forward, and will be an interesting webinar today to discuss those issues.
Thanks, Stephen. Ritesh. I think Ritesh has been having some technical difficulties there, but I think if he comes back on, we'll swing immediately to him. But without missing a beat, I think we move straight into it. And I guess that one of the biggest impacts we saw first in Australia was the impact of vessels bypassing Chinese main ports. Now, from an Australian perspective, that means reduced imports of retail goods, and of course, those retail goods come in 20-foot and 40-foot containers, which then are refilled locally with a whole range of agri products for re-export. And so probably just starting on, maybe Chris is probably a question for you. Just one on vessel movement. What are we seeing around the bypassing, blank sailings, and how is that sort of, we live in a just-in-time world. We live in a world where someone, I guess, somebody catches a cold, and then by the time it gets to the other part of the world, it is indeed pneumonia. And I guess so it is with just-in-time shipping. So maybe vessel movements. What's been experienced, and are we on the way back?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Well, I think it's fair to say that the shipping industry has been hugely impacted by COVID-19. What we are doing at ICS is we've been pushing both the regulators, which for the shipping industry is IMO and ILO to a certain extent, but also the G20 countries to promote the need to keep trade flowing. The difficulty in order to keep trade flowing is that ships themselves are subject to all sorts of rules and regulations that are becoming very difficult to comply with. So there's a number of fundamental issues that are impacting us at the moment, whether it's the certification of the ships, the certification of the seafarers. Actually getting seafarers on and off ships is perhaps the key one at the moment, with no flights, ports not allowing people to be landed, not being able to transit through the countries, quarantine periods, etc., etc. All of this is slowing down the whole transportation process. In addition to that, whilst we're not monitoring it per se, there are clearly longer waiting periods in ports because of this, which is affecting transportation and logistics chains. Is that enough for now, Peter?
No, I think that's really good. Quickly to Stephen and then to Mahim, your thoughts on the impact of vessel movements in and out of ports.
So the impact on the vessel movements from our vantage point that we've seen over the past month has been tremendous. It's twofold. One, with the number of blank sailings that have increased over the past, 6 to 8 weeks at this point. As Peter, you alluded to, there's less cargo coming into North America, and with less 20-foot and 40-foot supply which is the predominantly import-based market in North America, there is no containers that are here empty for export. So what we've continued to see week over week is challenges on keeping the demand and the product moving. We're probably running at about 50% capacity on shipments going to Asia and Southeast Asia ISC as a result. It's a constant fight for movement. And as the new blank sailings are continued to be announced from May onwards, this problem is basically going to continue until further notice. What we keep talking about internally is when North America goes back to work, when they go back to buying goods and consumer items. It's at that point that the shipments from China will resume, and it's probably going to be a 6-week turnaround from that moment before things resume in Canada, because those ships have to come into North America. They've got to be discharged, and the discharging currently right now is also affected. A lot of importers with their employees at home don't have the ability to discharge those containers that are sitting at their warehouses right now. And so the whole container cycle chain here is impacted. The other effect of the blank sailings that we've seen is that with congestion within the transloading facilities that we have, your ability to return to the port is now not every week, it's every second week. So you're starting to accumulate large amounts of loaded containers at various different locations waiting for vessel space. And while we were assuming that the vessel space would open up as only essential goods could move out of the country for export, I would say more to Chris's comments that because a lot of the international trade is considered essential, there's a lot more goods moving than people might realize export out of North America. And for that space, whether it's forestry products, agricultural products, or things of the like, vessel space continues to be a challenge as well.
Thanks, Stephen. Mahim, from your perspective.
Unfortunately, things are not very different from what Stephen has already talked about. In India also, we are facing similar issues where majority of the containers which have been imported are either stuck at the terminals or at the CFS itself. The deliveries or the offtake from these terminals has come down to maybe 20 to 30% of what they were before COVID-19. And because of that, obviously, the export consignments are also in a limbo, because the whole cycle which needs to work with the import-laden containers being cleared and empties being available, there's big shortage of empty containers. Of course, the blank sailings have not really helped, because whatever consignments were in the pipeline and have been loaded are now again stranded at the ports, because the vessels have started skipping calls, and then they're basically just sitting there and incurring more expenses.
I guess not unrelated. I had a colleague actually from the GPC made commentary last night via WhatsApp that the shipping lines are not providing accurate ETAs, and then we have the issue of the when containers are getting stuck at either receiver ports or destination ports, you have the issue of demurrage, detention, and those sort of things. How are the shipping lines largely responding, and is there some clemency, some compassion? What's the practical impact? Because remember, we run on a marginal business. Commodity traders, product traders are running on relatively small margins, and having containers stuck at destination or at origin, those daily charges rack up quite quickly, and I guess North America rail demurrage as well starts piling up. What are we seeing the practical and financial implications rolling on? And are we seeing a little bit of, I guess the word is fairness, but in the trade there's no such thing as fairness. But maybe starting with you, Chris, what are you hearing? What's the pushback?
Yeah, well, we're not really hearing anything from specific shipping lines, because our members are the member associations rather than the shipping companies themselves. However, I spent 25 years in industry working for a shipping company, and I don't think for 1 minute that the shipping companies themselves are deliberately missing calls or not communicating properly, because at the end of the day, you're their customers. And I know from my own experience how important keeping your customer relationship is. So I think it's more of a problem that they don't know themselves at the moment, because of the restrictions that have been placed on individual ships as they're sailing around through the different countries and the different ports. They don't quite know what what their current ETAs are, at least not looking forward. And I think the whole thing is very difficult. I mean, we could add to it that what we are seeing, however, is far more protectionism from countries, and perhaps understandably so. That because with COVID, it's not just this face-to-face contact that is the problem. It stays alive on surfaces. So you've got the concerns of the port workers and the seafarers themselves in handling the goods and products. And I think that the restrictions that are being have been implemented in various countries, and has already been mentioned about having excess stowage within terminals and difficulty for delivery onward within the country. This whole thing just slows the whole process down. And of course, shipping lines, if they're gonna, one of the key things that shipping lines will always try to look at and avoid is waiting for berth time. So if you're getting backup in the ports, they might consider skipping ports if it's for a small volume, if they are going to be spending an unpredictable number of days sitting at anchor waiting to come in, when they could be a little bit more sensible for them to do alternative calls. Thank you.
Thanks. Stephen?
From our vantage point, we've seen pretty much the status quo from steamship lines in terms of how they're approaching things. Of course, with the issues that are arriving at destination and the inability to pick up cargoes, that is obviously a common message that we're relaying to the steamship lines. We're getting varying results, to be honest with you, with respect to how they're reacting. We've seen some steamship lines actually take a more aggressive approach during this time, both on the collection of the cargo at destination and in collections in general. And we've seen other steamship lines be more lenient towards the situation that's occurring. So I can't paint all the steamship lines with the same brush, because they are taking different approaches. But what I do sense overall is a concern from the lines about the situation, and more economically as well, and how the inability for cargo to move and be picked up at destination, and maybe some financial concerns as well, how that's going to impact the number of like long-standing shipments that are dwelling at destination. Will people default on the cargo, and what the ripple effects of that is going to be. So we've actually seen a more aggressive push from lines going forward at this point.
Thanks, Stephen. Mahim?
We also have sort of a mixed bag of affairs at the moment. So what the government of India has done is that they have passed a circular. They have in fact directed that for the initial 21 days of lockdown, which was till the 14th of April, there was supposed to be no demurrage or no ground rent, etc. charged on shipments which have landed in India and have not been cleared because of this lockdown. With the lockdown now being extended till the 3rd of May, I suppose maybe a new circular might also be coming on similar lines, or maybe some other sort of concession. We have again received a mixed bag of feedback from most of the shipping lines that we have here. Some of them have gone ahead and supported us in implementing the guidelines of the government, whereas some shipping lines have taken 3 to 4 days in getting back to us on our requests, because they are taking multiple requests from principal offices, etc. So some of them have been quite cooperative, and few shipping lines are actually still trying to enforce the demurrages, etc., and sort of getting into an arm twisting tactic. I think that's the word for it, to recover these payments.
Yes, it's an incredible time. And I guess flowing on from that, I'm certainly getting some feedback here in Australia where documentation has slowed down as a result of, people are working from home. And of course, if you're, so I guess we can talk specifically about your experience with shipping lines, with bills of lading and making amendments to bills and all those sorts of things, but right through the banking channels and of course, the governments with phytosanitary and certificates of origin and those sort of things. What are we seeing there in terms of how well the industry has pivoted to working from home? As you can see, I'm in my home office, and we see it all around Australia. People are working from home. So how are we seeing the documentation flow, and are we coming through the worst of it? Starting with you, Chris, any feedback?
Thank you, Peter. Well, no, this is too far down into the details for what we deal with. However, again, from my previous experience, I can quite see that trying to do bill of lading issues working from home can be particularly challenging. But we move on in the world in terms of digitalization and communications. So I think there are going to be quite some lessons to be learnt for all of us when we actually come through this period as to what needs to be put in place going forward.
Stephen?
From our vantage point, we've seen a switch from original bills of lading with a lot of our customers during this period of time to telex releases. The steamship lines have been waiving fees for that. Previously, a lot of them had additional surcharges with that. So that's helped with release of certain documents and shipments. With respect to the balance, steamship lines are changing it to, here in Canada, to weekly pickups instead of daily pickups. So there's set days and specific times where you must be present to pick up the documents, typically in person. So that's been a bit of a challenge to coordinate that, to make sure without the daily deliveries, you got those deadlines hanging over you. With respect to certificates of origin and different documents of that nature, it's been pretty successful in changing that online. One of the things that we've actually taken away from this as a company is that, for us, the documentation process has been very paper driven. And that as we moved our documentation staff at home, and that was the department that struggled the most in working remotely at first, we're learning different ways to work remotely, and we actually are becoming more paperless in the process. And our staff have been creative in trying to find solutions and being innovative to say, okay, I know this is the way we've done it before, but how can we do it differently in the context that we might be in this situation for a couple more months? So the success thus far has been fairly positive, and I would say the impact on the documentation flow from our vantage point to our customers has been limited at best at this point.
And Mahim, what are you seeing?
Unfortunately, here in India, I think the impact has been augmented quite a bit, because even, let's say, with some delay, the documents have reached our hands. Because of the courier services not functioning. If in an export consignment, we are not able to present the documents to the bank. So let's say with some good luck, we are able to execute an export shipment, and with some delay, even get the original documents in hand. But there is, at the moment, no mechanism in place to present these documents. And hence, it's not really solving the entire problem that we see, because just shipping the goods is not the solution we are looking at. We also need to get paid in time, and our buyers also need to get the original documents in time to release the cargo at their end. So even telex messages can help, let's say, with respect to getting the containers cleared, but what about getting the payments? So
Yes.
The banks so far we work with have not been very accommodating in changing the terms to maybe accept copy documents. So maybe going forward, yes, if this digitization can happen in all aspects of the supply chain, definitely, I think that's a big learning going forward.
And I guess to follow on from that, there's been some discussion that some of the big four commodity players, ADM, Bunge, Cargill, Louis Dreyfus, moving to more digital trading platforms. Do you think out of this we will see more of the digitization of those supply chain documents, and maybe certainly setting the pulse industry up for a blockchain type revolution following this? Is that a reasonable comment? Maybe Mahim, straight back to you.
Possibly. I think that's the only silver lining I see in this entire situation that we are in. Maybe it will force our hand to pick up the pace on going towards that direction. Just to give you an anecdote, for example, in India, in one of the major container handling ports, the shipping lines and the customs have gone ahead and giving electronic delivery orders. But that's a much needed benefit that was required. but I think that's still a part of the solution. There are still a lot of constraints in clearing the cargo, taking delivery of the cargo. So I think it's a good point to start with by having all our documentation, etc., move to a digital platform.
And Stephen?
I think the pandemic, as it evolved, has definitely highlighted the need to accelerate some of the electronic options that are available for documentation, and blockchain being at the forefront. Ourselves as an organization, we've been exploring blockchain ourselves, but I think like many companies, we're waiting for the technology to be developed and to be a little more defined in terms of it's going forward. And I think this is just going to bring it to the forefront. We'd like to think that this is going to be a one-in-a-lifetime event, but we have to prepare for something that may occur in future. So I think whether it's blockchain or similar type technologies, trying to find ways to increase the flow of documentation and to avoid these issues in the future, I think are going to be accelerated. I think there's going to be more of an emphasis, not just from the logistical trade, in terms of, okay, how do we digitize ourselves more moving forward, and how do we make sure that we're prepared for just the events like this, or just for the evolution of technology itself.
Chris?
Just a comment, really. I think, Peter. I mean, certainly my last employer, we were already using electronic bills of lading 5+ years ago. What we also were doing was promoting the use of waybills rather than bills of lading. Now, I know that waybills don't suit everybody because it depends on whether you want to trade with it, but there are alternatives out there already to the situation. Should you be able to get agreement between the carrier and the shipper?
Right. And certainly, I mean, I certainly am of the view that there are some things we are not going back to, and I think the push towards digitization and digital platforms is just going to continue at a pace. We certainly have the technology, we have the communications. We just need to move with the times, I guess. And government, I guess, from a government perspective, in your experience, who's doing it best in that digital space right now in terms of issuance of documents? What's been the experience so far? Mahim?
Well, to be honest, India, I think, has taken this as an opportunity to move ahead and speed things up. Looking at things how they have been in the past 2 weeks across major ports, I think we are looking at the government adapting to this quite quickly, and maybe going forward, I think we have a lot of scope to improve on this.
Stephen?
I would say from a North American perspective, I believe the governments have been fairly hands-off with respect to the ports and their activities. We don't see too much involvement in there other than deeming them an essential service and allowing them to keep operating. We've seen different organizations trying to leverage the government for more support to move, to get cargo to move. But from a government perspective, I would say it's not the area of focus for them at this point.
Yeah. Chris?
I think generally we've seen the vast majority of countries try to be pragmatic and flexible when it comes to this, and we're certainly seeing far more electronic port clearance and things like that rather than attendance by people on board. So that's all been quite positive. I think Stephen is right. North America is probably more reluctant to go down that road than some of the others, but the more emerging nations tend to take this on board quite quickly, from what we've seen.
As a general comment, somebody who's involved more on the CFR brokerage side, I've seen the customers, certainly the ones I'm dealing with, been very responsive in whereas historically there might have been a bit of propensity to drag their feet in getting amendments to letters of credit or responding to shippers' needs or questions. We seem to have, And whether it's a cycle right now where people are concerned about food supply and shipping supply, we are seeing the customers, I think, just engage a little bit more constructively with exporters and trying at least to see to have things flow more readily rather than create further bottlenecks. Has that been your experience, Mahim?
Yes. Yeah. I think, yeah, going ahead, what we have seen in the past 2 to 3 weeks, it's definitely the sellers and the buyers coming together on a common platform, because to be honest, one cannot exist without the other. So I think middle ground is being found on a lot of issues, be it payments, documents, or even discharging cargo in an absence of original bills of lading. So yes, I think it has brought together both sides of the trade together to find a solution which ultimately keeps trade alive in these times.
Stephen?
Well, I can't comment directly on from a seller and consignee perspective. From a service provider and customer perspective, we've seen a lot more communication and collaboration with clients. I think everybody is trying to just keep each other in knowledgeable and informed as to what's happening both in their realities. So whether that be us as a loading and freight forwarder and what we're experiencing, or them as an exporter and what they're experiencing with their buyers. The more information and knowledge we have, the better we can understand, and the more that we can take it back to the respective parties that we need to speak to as well. So if anything, I would say that throughout this pandemic, and we've seen more collaboration, we've seen more customers that are really trying to engage and understand our business, and the same tool, we're trying to engage and understand theirs. We've probably learned more about our customers and how they interact with their buyers overseas, for example, in the last month than we have in the last couple of years, just because we're asking more questions. We want to understand what is happening at destination. How are they collecting their payment terms? What is that going to mean for the long haul? And then as we work together on that to find solutions, it can help them kind of plan forward and trade, and it can also help us to understand and forecast as well, because we've been actually hiring additional staff during this time to accommodate, what our customers are telling us moving forward.
Chris, do you have some comments there on that?
Well, obviously, I can't comment directly, Peter, but the word collaboration is actually quite a takeaway from this whole situation. We've also seen far greater collaboration and less working in silos than we've seen historically within the industry, and we know that the shipping industry is diverse. It's and does tend to work in silos to a large degree. So I can only echo what's just been said by Stefan. Really, we see the same thing at an industry level, and that's a positive, I think, to get us through and to keep the trade flowing.
Peter, can you hear me?
Yes, Randy.
I just wanted to mention that Ritesh is on by phone, so you probably can't see him, but just so you know, he's there to ask questions.
Right. Ritesh, would you like to first of all do your quick intro and make some comments as you see fit as well?
Sure. Thank you. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I think it was working till it stopped working, so sorry about that. I hope you can hear me now at least. Yes,
we have you.
Okay, perfect. So just in terms of a quick introduction, probably before I jump in, my background is we are an integrated shipping and logistics company, largely focused on the business between the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, including Singapore and that part of the world. As an organization, we own and operate largely feeder container ships. We own and operate a fleet of containers, and we have our integrated logistics and supply chain businesses at the back end. So that includes warehousing and land transport, custom clearances, air freight, sea freight, wherever applicable. So I was just listening into the conversation so far, and I think it's really interesting to hear the perspective from different parts of the world and different people. But I think without commenting on a specific question at the moment, I think the biggest challenge or the biggest issue that trade seems to be facing from all perspectives is definitely the use of technology and how adaptable different stakeholders in the supply chain are to the technology. So I think that's probably the largest challenge that everyone seems to be facing, albeit at different levels and different scales wherever they are.
Very good. Thanks, Ritesh. And I guess, following on a little bit, and I was talking to a colleague or a friend of mine today in the shipping business in Australia, and he has great concerns about our harvest because, we're already in a situation where we're not getting the imports in terms of in 20s and 40s. And, there's a lot of supply of empty equipment being stuck at sort of consolidation points at places like Port Louis and Mauritius and those sorts of things. So I guess if we pivot forward to the North American pulse harvest, which is really the big one, and of course, and the Black Sea, and then we talk about Australia at the end of the year, how concerned are we in terms of equipment supply, vessel sailings, services being able to be spun up to meet August, September out of North America, and I guess July, August out of Black Sea and Western Europe, and then as we roll into sort of September, October, November here in Australia in terms of equipment. And I guess extending on that, does that mean potentially we are going to engage more on the bulk shipment than containers? So just some comments on supply and demand of equipment, services, and whether we might see some structural shift away from containers into bulk conventional. So maybe start with you, Ritesh, given that you've been a little bit one out, one back there.
Sure. I think just if I was to look at it from a 30,000 foot view, I think today we're seeing a drop in terms of throughput for about 20 or 25% globally as the shipping industry, and about 13 or 15% depending on what stats you read in terms of container ship operators that have idled ships just in the last month. So I think one of the fellow members on the panel mentioned a short while ago, I think that the largest issue is going to be restarting the entire supply chain, because while it sounds easy, if the ship's tied up, you just start it up again or start her up again. Unfortunately, it takes a little longer for the entire supply chain to work again. So whilst I don't have too much of a say in terms of the bulk markets, but I do, from what I read and what I gather, it wouldn't surprise me to see some of that cargo shifting in different parts of the world. But as far as the other big crop, at least for us, for someone who lives in the Middle East, is the crops that are coming out of the Indian subcontinent now. That's always historically, again, been a container trade. And at the moment, we're seeing about a 10-15% drop of volumes, even on the food and other commodities that are essential. And that same trend is likely to continue even if things slowly start up again.
Thanks, Ritesh. Mahim?
I'm not sure how much I can add on to what Ritesh has said about the availability of equipment. But if I talk about the Indian commodity basket that we have, so India traditionally is not into too much of exports into agri-commodities. We have a few commodities which have traditionally been moving in containers. And yes, we are dependent upon the availability of empties. So apart from that, to be honest, I'm not too equipped, I think, to comment on how the situation is going to be in the months to come. I mean, we hope the other players in the supply chain can, support us in that. And apart from that, not much to add at my end.
Stephen?
The situation in North America, I think, just remains a bit fluid. To speculate on what's going to happen in August, September, I'd like to be optimistic and say by that point, if North American society resumes back to traditional habits by, July 1st, then, at that point, at the end of August, September, and October, we should be okay from a container supply perspective and the ability to move cargo out. But if this continues to move forward in past July, with every week that goes by, it is going to start to affect the ability to move the crops. And then with relation to bulk vessels, we see a backlog of bulk vessels currently sitting in Vancouver, for example, waiting to leave. So bulk vessel movement has been backed up additionally out of Canada. And so whether it moves bulk vessels or containers, a lot of that is price driven. And so, the customers are going to look at the best options to move their cargo to respective countries, whether it's bulk vessel or containers. Some of it is locked into bulk vessels, some of it is just containers, but there is that kind of volume in the middle. And then a lot of that is going to just to play into freight costs and exactly where those freight costs are at that given point in time, depending on, again, when people start resuming their traditional habits and getting back to work.
Yeah. Chris, any comments there?
Thank you, Peter. Well, I think it's a bit early to say at the moment, isn't it? We don't quite know where this is going, and I think different countries are dealing with this in different ways. Here in the UK, we're expecting to be announced for another 3-week lockdown here, but I see that today President Trump has announced potentially an easing of restrictions in the US. So I think Stephen is right in what he says. I think this depends on when things start to change, and it has a lag effect. So whether you're able to meet the harvest target periods will depend on when countries start to ease the lockdown process and then ease all the restrictions.
In terms of the, I guess looking at some of the hotspots, I mean, we've seen COVID-19 has led to lockdowns. Suppliers in the chain are temporarily ceasing production. Dal mills in India. We've seen factories being closed in China. Logistics providers can no longer transport goods as seamlessly, particularly across borders. Just get some commentary about what we're seeing. I mean, we haven't got anybody here talking about China. I mean, I'm hearing that we're seeing Chinese factories start to spin back up a bit as people go back to work. What degree of normalization are we seeing? I mean, Chris has just alluded to some of the things that people are talking about in the UK and the United States, and here in Australia, we know for the next 4 weeks we are locked down. So things are very, very slow here. But what is the experience around the globe? How are people seeing things come back to some degree of normalization? Mahim?
Thanks, Peter. I think in the past week or so, we have seen some sort of normalcy come back to the operations that were around at different ports in India. Of course, they are quite affected still compared to where they were 3 to 4 weeks back. But I think people have started to adapt to these limitations that are around with a lot of support from the government. Majority of the industries which were considered non-essential at the moment remain shut. Just to give you impact of what that means is that the power consumption in India has actually fallen by about 30% in the past 3 weeks. So going ahead, what the government has come out with the new guidelines, it seems that most of these industries are slowly going to get back into operation. Most of the mills or factories into essential commodities such as wheat or pulses continue to operate, some at maybe 50 to 60% capacity, some at 25%. So, of course, there are different constraints. So it's just not about processing the product. There are difficulties in getting the product from the mill to the end consumer because the supply chain still remains affected with the unavailability of trucks or laborers, etc. There are definitely restrictions in place in India also for cross-state transport, which we expect to come off in a staggered manner in the week to come.
Very good. Stephen?
As I previously had alluded to, the operations within North America, for the most part, have remained fluid. That things are moving to the best of everyone's ability, given the vessel space and equipment issues. Where we've seen the biggest challenges is on some of the little items, truck availability or staffing. For example, with the concern about COVID-19 and the health risk associated for those people who are in the essential service and having going to work, when someone gets a cold, for example, they're going home. right? And everybody that's been near that person the last couple of days, all of a sudden goes into a panic and they're going home. So we've seen fluctuations in terms of that with respect to, okay, we have scheduled drivers and they don't show up for a couple of days. We have scheduled staff and they are not going to show up for a week because they're going to go into quarantine and get tested. And we've had a lot of volatility with respect to that. So as that's been one of our biggest challenges in this environment is the human element and trying to just relate to that. And that's where I mentioned before, like we've now had to kind of overstaff to basically accommodate for the fact that we are expecting people to go home. We are expecting people to just have that concern. And we also, as a company, have to be conscious of that, to allow them that opportunity just to go and take care of themselves for that week, to make sure their mental frame of mind is there and go from there. With respect to movements at the ports and different things, just because of the blank sailings and because of the issues, there is a lot more congestion at the ports as well. So that's been a little more problematic. But for us, it's more just related about the ability to move cargo at this point.
Very good. Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I think governments are in a difficult position with this. They are, and it depends on what their priorities are. So they're under enormous pressure from a public health perspective and not overwhelming health services. But they're also under a lot of pressure from fiscal and economic reasons to get the economy restarted and to ease lockdown periods. And so we're seeing different things in different countries from what our members tell us. But certainly we saw in Singapore when they did lift restrictions that they ended up with this second wave where it all suddenly increased again. So add that into the mix. Governments, I think, are they certainly here in the UK, they tell us they're being guided by the science, and I think they're taking a fairly conservative view on that so that our health service is not overwhelmed. But at the back of their minds, and I think this applies to most countries, and I would suspect particularly in the US, their principal concern is the economy. And for the economy not to falter or to go into free fall or whichever scenario they're looking at, then at some point it all has to be started up again. And I think we're going to see different approaches from different countries depending on who's at the helm from a political perspective.
Yeah. Ritesh, do you have some comments there?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Peter. I think I agree with Chris and a couple of points that I think everyone has said. Firstly, I think the biggest challenge that a lot of countries, especially if you look at India or you look at some of the countries in the Middle East, I think the biggest issue that they're likely to have is when and who bites the bullet. Because if we take India, for example, whilst the lockdown and the full lockdown, the way it's been done in India was definitely essential, the question that people are now slowly starting to ask is what's the long-term damage going to be? Mahim made a comment on the power consumption. If 30% of power consumption is down in India, we can only try and piece together the long-term impact that's going to have in terms of industry and employment going forward. And I think from a pure shipping perspective, if you look at different areas, I think you mentioned China right at the beginning. China had, and we are seeing this today, where there is a spurt of volumes coming out of China, but the issue is, again, getting the connectivity required to move those volumes out of China to the consuming markets in the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent. Similarly, if you look at India, with things probably slowly restarting in the following week and the next week after that, the challenge, again, is going to be evacuating of empties and containers that are lying laden in terminals not being cleared before we can even start looking at the fresh round of exports or imports. The Middle East seems to be impacted, but less so. But having said that, it's not anywhere near 100% either.
I guess we've got a question here from Manish Chaturvedi, and if I can paraphrase it, gentlemen, are we seeing the end of just-in-time inventory in terms of, particularly in the food business, maybe specifically the pulse business? Here in Australia, we are in a Western economy, yet we had a big run on toilet paper, and that's not a joke. We had people lining up and fighting over toilet rolls, which are quite an amazing sight to see in a country like Australia. But have we seen the end of just-in-time type logistics? Will we see, and particularly in countries like India, are pivoting back towards allowing some degree of stock building? Will we see more local manufacturing? Certainly in Australia, government policy seems to be talking about doing more stuff here, in terms of food manufacturing. We've lost an enormous amount of manufacturing capacity in Australia to cheaper supply sources, mainly based on labour. Get some comments on what you think the post-COVID-19 environment might be working towards in terms of just-in-time inventory. Start with you, Ritesh.
Thanks. I think that's a very interesting question, and I think the biggest issue that a lot of countries are going to have is, I think, faith in the system, because I think a lot of consumers, a lot of manufacturers, a lot of people who are part of the supply chain, in one way or the other, have been unable to do what they've promised to do for their customers. So I think one of the ways that might be answered in the future is probably, like you said, local manufacturing, stocking to some extent that they can, and not really planning as far ahead and trying to do a just-in-time kind of method. So I think that it wouldn't surprise me to see it shifting a little bit. It's probably not going to go extreme to the other direction, but I think there will be a small shift that we end up seeing.
Mahim, what are you seeing in terms of your company's view of the world?
To be honest, I think the situation is still quite fluid. Yes, there is definitely going to be some change in it, but we have to also factor in the economic side of situation. Maybe the processing industry in India is still quite fragmented. Maybe the bigger processors and manufacturers with big pockets might be able to have some more stock or inventory with them to carry forward. But what about the small scale or medium scale players in the sector? Also, I think we have to keep in mind that basis the reports which are coming in, the purchasing power of the people is possibly going to be a bit stunted with the economic slowdown that is supposed to be also coming with the COVID thing. So maybe the demand is going to be muted. Don't think anyone is going to be running at 100% capacity or efficiency as well. So I think a perfect balance still needs to be found, but I think the situation will still evolve maybe towards the end of the tunnel when we see the situation getting back to post-COVID era.
Stephen?
I believe this event is going to relate in a bit of a shift. I don't know if it'll be the end of just-in-time shipping, but I do think it'll be trying to find a harmony between the two, between keeping inventories levels there and then the just-in-time shipments that we've seen more so over the past 3 or 4 years, particularly with like reduced inventory stocks that we've seen overseas. So with that being said, I think we're also starting to see a little bit more of that, as well as I alluded to earlier with the communication. Before, customers were in a just-in-time frame of mode. For us, it was, what are you going to move in the next month? Whereas a lot of partners now are communicating with us where are they going to plan to move over the next 6 to 9 months. So I do see a shift as a result of this, and I think it's, we can assume it's a shift in terms of how they're communicating with their overseas markets as well. But I also think that there's going to be a balance between the two long term, and that this might just be kind of almost a bit of a reset to make sure that there's always a good level of the just-in-time as well as consistent inventories overseas as well.
Thanks, David. Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. If it's any consolation, the great British public watched what happened with toilet rolls in Australia and then promptly followed suit. So we went through exactly the same thing you did about a week later. With respect to the just-in-time thing, my feeling is that this is probably time-based. So I think in the short term that will probably be the case, that companies will definitely try and hold a little bit more stock, but generally human nature, we don't learn from our lessons, and over time the pain felt through any situation tends to ease, and then economics take over from the safety and security feelings you get with inventory holding. So I suspect that might happen in the short term, but it depends on how this plays out. If we're looking at 5-10 years down the line, we may, if nothing else significant happens like this, we may well be back to where we were.
Indeed. Another question or a comment from Gordon Bacon. We all know Gordon quite well. He says the New York Times is using the term economic ruin as 4-week unemployment has now topped 20 million people in the US. Have estimates been made about what type of consumer purchasing impacted, what's being impacted, and how long it has taken in the past to see a recovery in consumer spending after economic shock? So I guess this is a question or a comment around economics, and you're all leaders in your field, but what are you noticing in terms of what people are focused on in terms of their consumption patterns? And we say in the food business that everybody has to eat. Sometimes I've responded when I've spoken publicly and said, if you don't have money, you don't eat. So economics is critical. Just some comments as to what sort of shifts we might see in demand patterns and in the various regions. So maybe start with you, Mahim.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, I guess this gets us back to what we were discussing in the previous question. It's still too early in the day to comment, but from what feelers we are getting, we see the demand for certain essential commodities to go down a bit. That can be attributed to a lot of the food and beverage industry also taking a hit in the days to come. It is said that most of the hotel industry, the travel tourism industry is also going to be having some blank days. So I guess when people moving out less, spending less money, on such recreational activities or eating out, basis the hints that we are getting, I think certain commodities such as maybe chickpeas or palm oil, at least if I talk about in India, the demand is going to be a bit down from where we have been traditionally. Unless the economics around improve, maybe this will continue for the short to medium term.
Stephen?
Well, I won't profess that economics is my forte. I will say that I think, generally speaking, and we talked about this actually internally yesterday, for example, is what does society learn from this pandemic, first of all, right? As a broader question, like, as we have all been having to self-isolate for, here in Canada, it's been for about a month now. When you go back to your normal lives, where is your priorities going to be? Is it going to be on material items, or is it going to be on the things that you may have taken for granted before? So I think it might be too early to say where spending is going to go. I'd be curious on some of the statistics myself in terms of like how spending patterns have changed. Like I've seen things where they said the grocery market may not be the same because people are buying groceries online more often. Some of the big box stores might see more online shopping increase that extends long term. Or we might see the effects of like everybody, that everybody's free mentality, and we're going to go out and spend because we've been locked up in cases. I mean, it's really an unknown at this point. But if the patterns continue, or if there is because of the unemployment rates and the economy and how distraught it is at this point, if consumer spending goes down, then the challenges that we're going to see in North America will continue for a while, because the steamship lines have built these massive ships to accommodate large volumes heading into North American markets, and exports out of North America are directly linked to imports into North America. The export market is a pure backhaul for the Chinese North American trade. So if that doesn't continue to normal, then the prolonged effect we'll see on exports out of North America will be ongoing for a while.
Chris?
Yeah, I think it's as Stephen has just said, it's a bit early to say, but I mean, we here are already seeing businesses calling in administrators here in the UK. So clearly things are going to change, and that is going to have some economic impact. Whether it's an increase in unemployment or a hit on the public sector borrowing requirement and all of these things. So there are challenges ahead. in terms of spending patterns, I mean, at the moment, because we're in lockdown and we're in week 4 here now, and it's only essential services that are open. So at the moment, spending patterns are purely down to either food and or what you can have online. That's it. Everything else is pretty much shut. As it becomes opening up again, I would suspect that from the peaks that the supermarkets and the food retailers have experienced over the last couple of weeks, that will probably tail off a little bit. But nonetheless, I suspect that that's still going to be the main driver here for some time to come.
And Ritesh, what are you seeing from Middle Eastern perspective?
Thanks, Peter. I think I tend to agree with all my fellow panelists. I think there's probably going to be a redefinition of your priorities, a redefinition of what's considered an essential good or an essential commodity. I think looking at the countries where I am and looking at just around me, I think employment is going to be a big question mark. That's going to definitely dictate spending patterns directly. Government policy, whether there's going to be stimulus in different economies after this in some way, shape or form, I think that's going to definitely have an impact on spending patterns as well. So it's a little early to say in terms of which way it's going to go. But having said that, I read an article yesterday out of China that there was $2.7 million sales of an Hermes store in Guangzhou yesterday. So if that's anything to go by, who knows where things will be in the next couple of months.
And I guess not unrelated, and of course to go to your commentary on stimulus. I mean, here in Australia, the government has embarked on an enormous stimulus package in terms of trying to support businesses and employees. We expect unemployment to double here from about 5% to 10% by the end of the June quarter. That's quite an enormous unemployment rate for us here in Australia. We've been essentially full employment for quite a while, and very big economic shocks. And so the question I have, all the talk about the stimulus, which is in the hundreds of billions of dollars for an economy the size of Australia's, is how that's all going to be paid back. But the other thing we haven't really talked about is the politics. And there's, we're hearing about the Japanese trying to woo companies based in China back to Japan. We've seen the US focus on supporting more things being done in the US from a manufacturing perspective, and we've certainly got the same rhetoric here in Australia. But what of the politics? I mean, clearly there is lots of talk about what China knew, what they didn't know. How do we think the politics might play out here from a speculative perspective? Because that's going to help. That's going to impact economics and trade flow. So I guess we're treading in a little bit of different waters, but our business is highly geopolitical, and we need to consider trade relationships going forward. So maybe Chris, start with you.
Thank you, Peter. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the politics is going to have a huge amount to play in this. We are definitely seeing it through this pandemic, quite a lot of protectionism, and that definitely is politically based. I think in the short term that's probably going to continue. That has negative connotations for global trade, of course, and the shipping industry in particular. I think it depends on how countries develop their exit strategies from this, which will also have political connotations. And of course, we are all of us subject to different political regimes within our own countries, from Europe, where it's either mostly central, left or right, but centralized anyway, to more extreme political regimes in different parts of the world. But nonetheless, all of them are going to have some impact on this in the short term. My view is that in the longer term, that this will probably play itself out a little bit, providing we don't have another event.
Yeah. Stephen?
I think to echo what Chris just said, I think in the short term, it's going to be a lot of protectionism. I think a lot of governments are purely focused on what is going to drive the health and well-being of their citizens first and foremost. Also, what is also going to drive the voters in the region too. I mean, we've seen some very creative political actions from different leaders over time, and I'll take, without going to specifics, where they have their political livelihood at stake as well. And so some of these decisions are based on the health and well-being, and some of these decisions are based on what they feel the populations want to hear. As time goes forward and we evolve from this, I do think that there's going to be a natural reset that'll happen. I don't know if the cultural landscape politically can change that much within a current month period, although this might have the tipping point to get to there. However, if this pandemic were to go on for another 4 to 6 months, for example, then we could be in uncharted waters. At that point, you might start to see more extreme reactions in terms of, okay, maybe you can't export your commodities out of your country. Perhaps you need to keep it within there for localized consumption. So I think as this continues to develop, we'll really get a sense as to how the governments are going to react with respect to this, and then how that's going to impact pulses in particular.
And of course, India is the big game in town, Mahim, and we've seen a fair bit of protectionism from India probably for the last five years or so. How do you see it playing out?
Thankfully, I'm in the right line and not into politics, so I can put my head out and say something. But I think going forward, yes, most of the countries definitely are going to look for ways to maybe lower their dependence on China. But to be very honest with you, China is definitely the biggest consumption center in the world for majority of the commodities. They're also the biggest manufacturers for majority of the products that are there. So I think to replace them or to lower the dependence on China for majority of the countries, it's definitely not going to be an easy task. But like Stephen said, if the situation drags on for a few more months, maybe, who knows? But definitely not easy to keep China out of the equation in global industry perspective.
And Ritesh?
Thanks, Peter. No, I agree with Mahim here that whilst a lot of countries may want to replace China or may believe in the politics of saying that, we should be independent and not trade as much, I think completely shutting China off is going to be near impossible, at least in the short run. Having said that, I think what you may see if this prolongs for 4 or 6 months is you may see different manufacturing hubs appearing for different markets. Perhaps you may find South America does some manufacturing for North America, or you may find India does manufacturing for Africa, for example. So you may not see complete protectionism. At the same time, you may not see the kind of east-west trades that we're used to seeing. So you may maybe in the medium term have some sort of a shock to the supply in terms of at least the container shipping industry. Of course, I think that's it's a little far-fetched, but I think that that's something that, maybe wait and watch and see how it develops. But I think in the short term, whilst countries may say things to keep the people amused and different presidents and prime ministers may say things, but I think it's still easier said than done to replace existing supply chains overnight, at least.
All good comments, I guess. I guess the big elephant in the room at the moment is the price of oil. We are, I think, in about 2.5 months, we have moved oil from above $60 a barrel to about 19 or 20. So I guess what's the panel's view in terms of the stimulatory outcome from cheaper oil? And we know that there's been some deals cut in the last 24, 48 hours to try and cut supply and those sort of things. And it goes to a couple of the questions that are on the webinar here with regards to looking at bulk vessel rates and container rates as a result of this significant poleaxing of oil in terms of of price. Will that flow through to tramp rates and container vessel rates, or do we think that there's underlying structural concerns, as one of the panelists outlined earlier, about the size and the scope of the container shipping industry? And we know there's been lots of consolidation. Will we see further consolidation? How will the rates be affected? And is there going to be disproportionate rate structure between bulk and container type traffic? Maybe Chris, start with you in the hot seat.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. That was a lot of questions. Well, the oil situation is one thing, and clearly, we've just gone through this sulfur 2020 requirement from IMO now to bring it down to 0.1%, and the costs of the low sulfur fuels are more or less, or not far off, the same price as distillate gas oil, so on and so forth. So any reduction in oil prices has a positive effect for the shipping industry generally. On a more global perspective, of course, we're going into the Northern Hemisphere summer, where demand for oil is generally lower anyway. So I'm not quite sure how that's going to play out. I'm not an economist, so but clearly there's an interaction there between demands in the Northern Hemisphere summer and oil prices and supply and demand. With respect to the lines and the COVID-19 pandemic, I think what we're going to see is that we're going to see a lot of the smaller players really struggle during this period. And I don't necessarily mean just the container lines, I mean generally in the shipping industry. On the container side, it's mostly done through alliances anyway. You have some of the smaller players, of course, but they are tending to trade into the more outer regions of the world. So will there be more consolidation? I mean, you're possibly not in the short term, I don't think, but I think there'll be some. I think there'll be some players falling out of the market altogether amongst the smaller ones. That would be my view. But I think again, it depends on how long this takes to restabilize. So yeah, it's going to be tough times. Shipping industry hasn't done so well for the last 10 years as it is, and this is not helping. And I see my previous employer is struggling at the moment, so, and this will not have helped.
Yeah, Stephen?
From our vantage point, this is a question we get asked quite regularly with respect to the oil prices and container freight rates. While it is reducing the oil component of the freight rates, the adverse effect of blank sailings and lack of equipment and the increased demand, we're not seeing the net results. We're actually seeing pricing in container freight go up in this time. I would say systematically every week, from one carrier or another, we're starting to see general rate increase notifications. The container freight rate market, export-wise, out of North America, has been very depressed for multiple years. Again, it's considered a backhaul. So the carriers are going to make their money on the import volumes, where they can bring in containers from China at $2,000-$3,000 a container, and then those same containers can go out at a fraction of the cost. With the equipment supply drying up, we're starting to see empty containers repositioned from China into North America right now. And those costs are actually increasing the export costs as well. So although the oil is a component, and we'll see it should drive down the pricing, the lack of overall supply and the supply-demand economics is driving the pricing up. And that could have an adverse effect long-term in terms of the differential between container freight rates and bulk vessels. Because I would say that the bulk vessel market perhaps isn't having that same supply-demand effects, although maybe someone else can speak to that on the panel more directly. But as the imports continue to be less, the rates and the demand for cargo going out of North America is climbing right now. And again, with more blank sailings projected for May, and I would suspect into June, it's probably going to be on an upward trend over the next month or so, for sure.
Mahim?
Thanks, Peter. I think I'll take a cue from what Stephen was talking about. I mean, that is what we are seeing on the container freights in India also at the moment. With the crude falling, we had expected that the container freights to fall as well for the export volumes. But I think because of the blank sailings which are coming in, equipment shortage, we have not really seen a drastic fall in the export rates. In fact, we see that the rates have in fact gone up. I am not an expert on the bulk shipments, but from what we have been reading and what we have been seeing, if the trend continues the way it is for slower economic performance in India, and if the power consumption remains muted, that means the coal consumption has gone down. We see in India that there is a lot of stock, or rather overstock of some of the refineries in India having crude stocks lasting for maybe 3 to 4 months. So maybe if the demand from India goes a bit down, possibly the freights for the bulk shipments might come down a bit, at least for Indian continent. Maybe Ritesh can have a better view on this.
And Ritesh?
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Mahim. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I have two perspectives on this. One as a ship owner and one as a feeder operator in the region. As a feeder operator who charters in ships, I think it's again simple mathematics, where if the container volumes are down, say out of India, the first thing that I'm going to do as an operator is try and cut my costs wherever I can, and that means off-hiring ships and reducing the supply. The moment I've reduced the supply enough, one way or the other, the prices have gone up for the actual shippers. So I think that's the situation that's been happening from at least a container perspective, container shipping line perspective. The other issue, and I think a couple of you alluded to it as well, the shipping industry itself as a whole has been suffering for at least the last decade or so. And the shipping industry has huge issues inherently with supply and demand. So I think in spite of record low oil prices, in spite of whatever else that should be working in the favor and reducing costs, the overarching issues of the industry on the whole, I think, are causing the issue that we have right now with the prices going up. There's a huge cascading of ships with every blank sailing. There's ships lying idle. I think I read 15% of the container fleet is lying idle today, which is reaching to numbers like we were in 2008. So as that continues to happen, unfortunately for trade, you might see rates staying higher than where they should be. So I think regardless of oil prices, I think you're going to see this trend happening for some time, at least in the near future, unless something really changes significantly from either a supply or a demand perspective. And just very quickly on consolidation, perhaps in the short term, I think obviously current markets may not allow consolidation, but I think that's definitely going to continue to be the future. You've seen it in container shipping industry in a very big way. And I think that's going to continue. I think only people who have scale will be able to continue in the near future. So that's going to be the trend going ahead.
Very good.
Peter, maybe just one more question and we'll have to wrap it up.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly the final question, and I'll give all the panelists a bit of a lead in, and then I'll just sort of give a little bit of a wrap that then allows them to close it. And that the question is going to be, what's going to change that will not change back after COVID-19? Okay. And I guess tonight, for me, it's 20 past 12 in the morning. We've talked today about, digitization and how that might improve, efficiencies of execution. We've talked about collaboration, which we don't hear much about in the commodity trade. Collaboration isn't a big part of our history. There have been people who've talked about, panelists have talked about adaptability, and the complexities around restarting the supply chain. Talked about fluidity, and that this thing is evolving as we speak. People are looking at what they're questioning their faith in the system. What we've seen panic. We've seen panic toilet paper. We know things are fluctuating. The question around discretionary spending versus those things we actually need versus those things we want, and the impact that'll have on logistics. The reprioritizing of life. What will happen? What will we be focused on post this? We talk about stimulus. We talk about protectionism, and the importance of scale. So we've covered a fair bit of territory today, which I thank the panelists. So just to maybe close, your comments on what's going to change that will not change back, or what has changed so far that's not going to change back after this this Black Swan event. Maybe start with you, Ritesh.
Thank you very much. And I think for me, the biggest thing that's going to change that will not change back, I think, is the utilization of technology in shipping and digitalization in shipping and the way we do shipping and logistics, both from a trader, from a consumer, from a shipper, as well as a shipping line or vessel operator perspective. I think other things, unfortunately, like I think Chris had mentioned, we tend to forget very quickly, or Stephen had mentioned, or Chris, I think, we tend to forget things very quickly, and we end up going back to where we started from. But I think technology is the only thing that I see that is completely inevitable. Everything else is, like you said rightly, Peter, is still in a state of flux, and it's anybody's guess. But the technological aspect of shipping and the industry, I think that's something that is long overdue, to be honest. And I think that's the one thing that's going to continue going in the future as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Ritesh. Mahim?
I think I completely endorse what Ritesh has mentioned, because I think the consumer behavior, the demands and everything, I think once situation gets back to normal, I think that we are again going to be back to similar buying patterns, spending patterns. The only thing that I think was much required was this digitization of the trade on different aspects of supply chain. And hopefully this is something that we can take forward, especially in India, where we are still a bit lenient towards human assets in play at supply chain. Hopefully with more digitization happening, there will be less dependence on the human element.
Thanks, Mahim. Stephen?
Just what Mahim said. So while I feel there'll be more digitization, I think that's going to be a big takeaway from this for the industry as a whole. Where I also feel that is going to be stable and a learning experience is communication and information. So on the one hand, we'll take the operational aspect of things and bring it more to the technological forefront, but the collaboration and the exchange of information, I think, between partners and that collaboration that we spoke about, I think will increase. I think, knowledge is power. And if one thing that we've learned from this, from our perspective, is that the more we communicate and the more that we keep our partners informed, the easier it is to try to find solutions and to try to understand reality. So I think that is going to be something that's going to prevail from this. As a society, we've gotten very isolated with electronics. We've gotten very short, very quick, and transactions have gotten very, systematic. And so while we can process the information faster, I think there is going to be more dialogue going forward between industry stakeholders.
Thanks, Stephen. And finally, Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Well, my first thought is that, change is inevitable, isn't it? So change happens every day in everything we do. I think this event has just heightened everybody's awareness that change needs to happen in many different areas. I would support what's been said about technology and digitization. That's one thing, but technology moves at a great pace anyway. It is about acceptance of technology rather than the availability of it. So all of the things that have been talked about today have always been possible for some time now. It's whether the attitudes of the people involved within the industry are prepared to accept them and take them on board. But I think from a wider societal perspective, I think people's attitudes, and particularly political attitudes towards public health services, will probably change going forward. I'm pretty sure that's going to be the case in the UK, and I'm sure most other countries will be the same. Because without that sort of funding for public health services, actually you can't deal with this type of pandemic at all. So that's my view generally.
A great human point to end on. Thanks, Chris. Randy, did you want to make some concluding remarks? you'll need to unmute. It's very rare that Randy is short of a word, I have to say. So this is one of those interesting times where Randy's short of a word. We got you back.
No lip readers there. Thank you very much, all of you, for participating in our first webinar. It's been quite an experience for us from a technical standpoint. We appreciate your and everything you brought and your time. This, for those in the audience, a recording of this webinar will be available next week. This is the first time we've used this big marker service, so please go ahead and give us feedback. We'd appreciate that. Our next webinar is going to be Red Lentils Global Outlook on April 23rd. That's going to be Brian Clancy of StatPub is going to be our analyst for that. Sudhakar Tomar is going to be our moderator. Fethi Sonmez from Armada will join. William Alexander, Sara Bhartia, Hadi Doni, and Kintal Islamov. So that will be our next webinar on April 23rd. Mark your calendars. The times will change for these webinars depending upon where we have the biggest audience for it. As I think Stephen and have noticed, there's quite a time difference between Australia and Canada, which proves to be a challenge for having webinars in our industry, but we hope you all can join. Thank you again for joining, and we hope you can participate as attendees or future webinars we have. Again, thank you very much, Stephen, Chris, Mahim, Ritesh, and Peter. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ray.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Indeed.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Stay safe, everyone.